This time around, I'd like to show you some stuff based on the bridge section, or the chorus section, if you will, from a tune called Sevens on my Erotic Cakes album. And it's this kind of thing. But I'd like to kind of simplify it a bit and hopefully make it more useful for what you might do in your own music. The genesis of that lick was trying to find a new way to play a major seventh arpeggio. And I started out by looking at it 2 notes per string. I guess with E flat major 7, so I'd start there. So you've got that network of notes, and you're doing this the whole time, which is always fun. And then I figured it might be interesting to split that up. So for each string, my tapping hand is doing the higher note and the regular fretting hand is doing the lower note. So that then gave me and then I thought, okay, if the notes are split up like that, then I don't have to play them in order anymore, and I can get more of a sequence rather than just highest note to the lowest note. And I thought, wonder what that will sound like. And you don't really get that sound any other way. Every note is on a fresh string. So if you experiment with how long the fingertips spend on their allotted note, you can get a really staccato sound or more of a solid. So one of the main things is to make sure you're hammering as hard as possible, especially with this rubbish finger, which is God's little joke at our expense. 3.5 fingers on each hand, but the more confidently you can hit those, the better this stuff will sound. So I'm using, because I'm weird, I've got the pick tucked away in the index finger the whole time, because I never know when there might be an emergency and I might need to pick a note, so it's just there. So I'm using the 2nd and 4th fingers on that hand, and indeed on this hand. Now I have the string damper there. Often I forget to put it on. So just to keep the noise to a minimum, I'm using index finger just as a blank. It's just resting lightly on those strings. And I'm just hammering again with the 4th finger and the 2nd finger. So that's the basic shape there. You might want to check that you can do that. And then if we move on to the next set of strings, there's a similar thing. Now I'd be using the 2nd and 3rd fingers. So exactly the same idea, but now the notes are that. It's a 4th interval instead of a 5th with each hand. And then you can move down to here. For some reason, I now use the 2nd and 3rd fingers on this hand. I think so that I can remember my bearings, and if I have to go back to the top string, I don't have to readjust too much. The wrist position hasn't changed too drastically. And with this hand, it's still the 4th finger and the 2nd finger, purely for anti-noise reasons. So we've now got a whole arpeggio that looks like that. You could continue, it gets a bit hairy there, because you've got 2 fingers on the same fret tapping different strings. And it's a bit of a tap dance there. You have to hammer this note and then get it right out of the way when this finger comes on, otherwise they'll collide with each other. And generally a finger is fatter than the distance between 2 strings, so it will end in tears if you're not careful. But you can see how the pattern would repeat until you run out of strings. Now, before I turn that into the actual lick from Sevens, which is not important because that already exists, that's mine. You need to come up with yours. It's interesting to have a look at all the different stuff you can do just by moving one hand up or down. Because you're just playing 2 notes of the arpeggio in terms of musical formula with this hand, and the other 2 notes with this hand. So I've got the root and the 5th there, and then the 3rd and the 7th there. So I could move this hand down a fret and it's a minor seventh now, or I could move it up and get this suspended sound. It's just one motor skill, and if you've trained your fingers to do that and they're in time and the notes are all loud, you might as well see how much mileage you can get out of that basic technique. Here's the final version of this idea in my world. This is as far as I took it. And the real twist here is because my tune is in a 7/4 time signature, hence the imaginative name. It kind of starts going down and then it reverses back on itself a little bit and then continues going back down. So it's the highest pair of strings, then the middle, then the highest again, then the middle, then the lowest, then the middle, and then the lowest again. Want more. So you can either hop onto the B string and go up another 3 frets, or, which I like to do, go back to the top E string and back to where you were. So now you've got one shape working pretty hard for you. You've got every note between there and there. You're not repeating any, you're not skipping any. It gets more fun when you start to complicate things and add some extra notes. So I might, for instance, want to have a minor 7th arpeggio, in which case I could maybe add the 7th there. Exactly the same idea, except this time this hand is doing a bit more work, kind of stretchy. You know, elbow down, wrist straight, thumb down. If you need the neck of the guitar up here by your nose, so be it. All that matters is that it sounds good. So exactly the same principle, or I could do it for a major 7th arpeggio, or I could go for something like this. It's kind of an unusual arpeggio that you don't hear every day. But it's no harder for your hand to execute than the humble minor 7th arpeggio. For any of these, all you really need is the shape on one string, and then the shifting protocol is the same. So for B major 7th, so it's there, 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 and then the same thing here. It might be worth really focusing on the shift between the end of one string and the start of the next. Because the last thing in the world you want is, 2 notes ringing, or something like that. As soon as you kick on the distortion, it's an ungainly sound. It spoils the whole monophonic appeal of a lick like this. So you might even check that you're comfortable with that thing, where every time one finger goes down, the other one releases. I think the main thing that throws people when they're descending in pitch is this kind of assumption that you can do the hammer-on backwards. And like if hitting the string really hard gives you a note, then removing your finger really hard should give you another note, and it doesn't. I think when you're coming down, your tapping hand has to act like a pick. You can test that just by having all the fingers lined up and then tell yourself you want to hear the 10th fret on the E string and see if you can get a really loud, convincing note. I'm deliberately doing this with a clean sound, even though it's harder. You could even try different dynamics. You could try to check you can do it soft and do it loud. Then when you kick in all the distortion and the gain, generally the best policy is to hit these notes as hard as you can. They will still sound fluid because you're not picking them. But if you play too softly, then all the background noise, the handling noise, will devour the notes that you're trying to communicate to people. Huh? So the more confident you can make those notes sound, the more assertive the pull-offs are. The thing I get asked about quite a lot is how do I use chromatic notes, how do I play outside? And I think one thing that's important to remember, you need to like the sound of chromatic playing and outside playing before you try and do it. You can't just do it because some other guy on the internet told you you're inadequate for not being able to do it. And the other thing to bear in mind is if you know the blues scale, you've probably used some chromatic notes in the most musical way possible without realizing that that's what you were doing. If you look at the minor pentatonic scale, and then you look at what we call the blues scale, which has this extra note, it's kind of the worst note in the world. If you land on that, you're hurting people. Really, really jarring note. And yet most of us know blues licks where we can use it in context, so it's an ornament to add a certain funkiness to the fifth or indeed the fourth. It's not meant to be a melodic note in its own right. It's meant to add a certain feel to the more correct sounding notes that live either side of it. If you can do that, then in theory you know everything you need to know to use any one of the 12 notes at any point over any chord, so long as you use it responsibly. And I think the main things are to play it safe. If you follow every chromatic, jarring sounding note with another good note that's not too far away from it melodically, if you can just step up a semitone and magically you're playing a note that's in the chord, that suddenly justifies the shocking note you played a millisecond ago. And the other thing that makes you sound even more confident is if you can arrange the notes in such a way that the good note lands in a more important part of the beat. And these are things you can't be too conscious of these things when you play. But if you're listening to what you do, then trial and error, along with trying to feel responsible for the notes you play, should result in that same end product. The chromatic notes going where they're most welcome, and the more melodic notes falling in the stronger places within the pulse of the music. So there are a few ways you could approach this. You might look at the pentatonic scale and fill in the gaps. Or something like that makes sense because you've got all these chromatic notes in a row, but the highest one and the lowest one are right, so the listener will forgive any anomalies they hear in between. Or you could maybe go right back to first principles and say, I'm going to use the notes that are in the chord, and that will be my template. So, I don't know. And then look at where the chromatic approach notes live relative to that shape. Huh? And something like that, there are some horrendously wrong notes in there, but because they're jutted right up against a chord tone, you're immune from criticism up to a point. And that seems to be how that works, or my personal favourite. It's the idea of the chord tones being the skeleton, and then you you flesh it out with chromatic approach notes. And when people talk about playing outside, I think that's the same thing, but you zoom out, you look at the same concept from further away. So instead of one wrong note leading up to a right note, it's a wrong key for a while leading into a right key. Same principles apply. If you can get lost but then somehow land on your feet without the melody jumping too far and with the first nice note happening somewhere important within the pulse of the music, you sound cool rather than wrong. And I find it interesting that you can use every single one of the notes in the chromatic scale and the listener will still know what chord you're implying. There must have been all 12 notes in there, but hopefully it sounds suitably like B minor rather than F major or something. It's where you put the notes, not what the notes are, that I think is the most important thing.